Welcome back to Uproarious. I'm Rory, and today we're going to talk about the emotional category known as fear. Fear is the second of our primary stress responses. Last week we covered anger and talked about how stress responses are formed. They start in the amygdala and then they send signals to our brain and kidneys to do different things. Just like with anger, our kidneys begin to produce cortisol and adrenaline while our brain continues to interpret the situation, contextualize it, and then tell us what emotion to feel. Up until that moment when we get that context, it's just a stress response. But once we get that context back from our brain, we will know that it is fear. Let's look at what the purpose is of fear. Now, fear tells us that we need to protect ourselves from a threat or protect others from a threat. And there are various ways that we can do that, but none of them look like fighting. Anger is what we do when we are fighting to solve a problem, but fear is what we do when we are either freezing, fleeing, or fawning over the person or thing hurting us. Just like all the other emotional categories, fear has its own subcategories of emotions that we have to think about when we're talking about fear. For fear, we have two major categories. We have fears that involve people and fears that don't involve people. Some of the words we use to describe our fear when we're talking about other people include being clingy or mistrustful. We may also be jealous, hypervigilant, or wary of others. When we're talking about fear without other people, we have things like worry, fright, apprehension, and terror. All of these words describe our interactions with the world and our fears about what the world has to offer us. Next, let's talk about what causes fear. Fear is caused when we perceive through any of our senses some sort of threat. The amygdala immediately springs into action, causes a stress response, and then waits for the brain to interpret the event. This can be very quick, including the wait time for the brain to interpret the situation and provide an answer. And so we can come to the wrong solutions or wrong conclusions in that brief moment where our thoughts go so fast we can't even notice that we've thought them. So just like anger, we have the amygdala send signals to the kidneys to produce cortisol and adrenaline. But when we get the signal back from our brain that the thing that we're looking at isn't something to be fought, but it's something that we should either avoid or fix or try to hide from, then we know that we're experiencing fear. As with all stress responses, fear is contextual, and so we only become afraid when we interpret that there's a reason to. So we do need to have a healthy relationship with fear so that we do understand when we need to be afraid. Let's talk about what fear communicates. Fear communicates to us that there is a problem or threat that needs to be mitigated, not fought, but either reduced or avoided. To that end, we have three specific sub-responses when we experience fear. They are flee, freeze, and fawn. So fleeing or flight is to run away. To freeze is to stay in place, to become immobile and become ignorable. And to fawn is to take care of the thing causing the fear. Fawning is something that we tend to do when we're afraid, and the person or thing that we're afraid of has an important role in our lives. Fawning has a lot of ways of manifesting itself, including praising a parent who's abusive or a partner who is abusive, taking care of their needs or trying to predict what they need and take care of them in advance. This feeds the unhealthy and abusive relationship and encourages the abuser in the end to continue doing what they're doing. But it's the only way some people know how to thrive or survive in an abusive situation, so it can be fairly common. If you constantly feel the need to take care of somebody or to appease their bad moods, you may be fawning in those moments, experiencing fear and trying to make yourself and them feel better to reduce the fear. Now let's talk about what fear feels like inside the body. Fear gives us a rush of energy. It gives us some creative power, some mental faculty that lets us think of novel solutions. It also increases our blood flow to our hands and feet in case we need to run away or do something to solve the problem. We may also feel protective action urges. These can look like sitting on our hands or putting our hands' palms together, closing our hands, or hiding them. These are all subconscious actions that we take when we don't feel safe. We can also throw things, scream, run, cry, or yell for help. We may also have the urge to just hide, even if it's not a very good hiding. We might feel the urge to climb under a desk, cover our face, hide behind a curtain, or wear extra makeup or extra clothing to feel less seen by other people. When we're trying to identify fear in ourselves and others, some of the things that we can see include sweating, shaking. Both of these come from increased stress hormones. The sweating is preparing us to cool down after vigorous exercise that comes with the adrenaline and the running. The shaking comes from having too much stress hormones in the muscles that are hard to clear out, and then the muscles lose some of their normal functioning, and that shaking comes from that. Fear also can look like squinting your eyes or flinching. It can look like covering your face or hiding, even if it is like a joking hiding, like somebody pretends to hide behind a newspaper or cover their face. It's not always a very grand gesture. Sometimes our expressions of fear are quite small, and that's because we may not feel safe expressing our fear. So paying attention to what somebody is doing, saying, and conveying with their body language is important to understand whether or not somebody's afraid. Next, let's talk about how fear relates to other emotions. Like we talked about in the video on anger, fear as a stress response has an easy time switching between fear and anger, and this is because the same chemicals promote fear and anger, and they're already present when you experience one emotion, and the main difference between the two emotions is our interpretation of events. So swapping between anger and fear is very quick and very easy. On the other hand, happiness and sadness are controlled mostly inside the brain instead of in the kidneys. And so the chemicals for happiness and the electrical activity for sadness can both be present while we are afraid, and we can experience both emotions simultaneously. This can be a little disorienting for some people, especially people who don't actually understand the situation that they're in. So young children in abusive situations or people who have witnessed traumatic events may have confused emotions because they may be feeling sad or happy along with angry or afraid. If we want to have more fear, we can just think of reasons that something might be fearful or dangerous. And if we want to experience less fear, we can think about things in ways that make us feel close to that thing, either pitying it, loving it, or feeling compassion towards the thing. Common strategies for addressing phobias include exposure therapy, but also using cute, pretty, small, and nice things to kind of change our perspective on what it is that we're talking about. So people who have a dog phobia may be introduced to puppies. People who are afraid of interacting with other humans may be introduced to small children or babies. All of this relies on the fact that context informs our emotions. And so if we have context for an animal not being dangerous, i.e. it's a puppy, it makes it easier for us to work up to spending time around a larger dog that may be seeming more dangerous generally. Next, let's talk about what it looks like when we have too much or too little of fear. Too much fear, or fear for too long, tends to become a persistent problem, known generally as anxiety. There are a number of kinds of anxiety disorders that can happen, and each of them is caused by experiencing one or more fearful events, either repeatedly or so intensely that they cannot shake that emotional experience. Fear is probably the oldest emotion any animal ever has experienced. It's a basic protective response that even very, very simple creatures have. And so when we are children, we experience fear of many things because we don't know what is and is not a threat. It's very common for young children to have fears about many normal everyday things. For example, when I was 4, I became terrified of a cookie jar that had a voice box inside of it that sang a song when you opened the cookie jar. But I had an association with electronics of that size being explosives in some movies, and so I was convinced that there was a risk that this cookie jar would explode. And even though my favorite thing at 4 years old was cookies, I would not open that cookie jar to get a cookie. Someone else would have to do it if I was to have a cookie. Other children may be afraid of the dark or afraid of things in their closet when the lights are out. And this is just a pure lack of knowledge, sure personal knowledge that things are the way that they are and things work the way that we expect them to. Children aren't born with this knowledge. They have to accumulate those experiences over their lifetime. And so it's very common for young children to be afraid. And it's not something to be super worried about unless they're showing compulsive behaviors or phobias. However, in adults, we don't normally feel afraid all that often. It can be kind of a strange experience for humans because we have evolved to feel fear regularly. It's something our body expects to do because it's what protects us from predators, bears, lions, even birds, diseases, and rotten food. Without fear, our body becomes slightly desensitized to the possible threats that exist. And so we end up with this weird relationship with fear where we often will seek it out for fun. We call this thrill or excitement sometimes, but when that thrill or excitement comes from fear and we're doing that recreationally, there is also a purpose for that. This kind of fear gives us a break from our normal stresses because when we experience fear, we have a very honed focus, a very narrow vision of what we're thinking about. We tend to forget about everything else that we worry about. So someone who has a high-pressure, high-paced job may enjoy going home and watching a horror movie because it's scary and that distracts them from their normal stressors. However, if that film is too realistic or believable for that person, they may experience genuine terror, and that is less than productive because the amount of chemicals that their body will produce is so high that they will continue to be afraid later. It might be easy to fall into the thought process of thinking that we should never have fear or that we should avoid it at all costs, but it's very important to experience fear. Fear helps us recalibrate our place in life. If we never experience fear, we eventually develop the sense that we may be invulnerable or that risks that we take don't have consequences. People who are in traumatic situations, especially abusive situations, start to unlearn their fear response to those abuses, and because of that, children who are abused often end up becoming adults who are abused, and that pattern partly continues because that person is not afraid of that abuse anymore. Another example of not having enough fear includes having too strong of other emotions. Someone who is too angry or too sad may not be able to engage in their fear as readily, and so there are countless stories of people who get really bad news and then die walking into traffic or stepping into a hole in the sidewalk when there's work being done by a crew, or combatants, in a war zone being killed because they weren't afraid enough to take basic precautions to keep themselves safe. And this can endanger ourselves and others in the process. Now that we've gone over all of the components of fear, I hope you'll join us in a few weeks for our specific skills-related videos that help us improve our relationship with fear and either increase or decrease our experiences with fear if needed. We still have one more emotional category, and that's disgust, which will come out next week. If you haven't checked out our videos on happiness, sadness, and anger, they are also in the same playlist on this channel under emotional literacy, or you can find them on the website under the category of emotions. Thanks for checking out my video on fear. If you want more information, including studies about how fear works and what it does for us, check the link in the description below. Thanks again for stopping by, and remember to be kind to yourself and to others.